Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I call this talk Where to Find Fen Raft Spiders. It makes it sound a bit like a Twitcher's guide, which it isn't really. So I've added in past, present and future to give you a slightly better idea of where I'm going. So I want to talk about the history of this spider in Britain, which we really know almost nothing about. So it's a bit of a sleuthing, shrouded in mystery business. I want to talk about its present status, and I want to talk about where we might expect to find it in the future. I'm not going to be talking much about the spider itself because I don't have enough time in this slot, but I'm sure everybody here knows that it's one of our biggest spiders. It's semi-aquatic and fantastically adapted to a semi-aquatic lifestyle. It's one of few spiders worldwide that routinely takes vertebrate prey, like this one here eating an unfortunate stickleback. There's lots more information on the spider on the dolomides.org.uk website if you want to find out more about its biology. I'm going to cover now. So, although most of my talk is going to be about the spider in Britain, I want to have a bit of an international perspective on this. This is very much a Palearctic species. So this map shows the orangey dots, I wouldn't study them too closely, are a scattering of the recorded distributions throughout its range. And the green areas are modelled areas of habitat that's potentially appropriate for it, or areas that are potentially appropriate for it in terms particularly of climate, but also in terms of topography and wetland availability and so on. So the main thing to note from this is that it's very much a sort of Central and Western European species, just creeping a bit south of the Pyrenees and the Alps and into the Balkans, and with a really big stronghold very much in the southern tip of Scandinavia. Suitable habitat for this species, it's very much a lowland species without its range. It likes neutral to alkaline, base-rich water, so unpolluted sites. So very much a spider where you have open water, so tend to be fen sites, some of the big wetland areas in Europe which are getting base-rich water from chalky substrates. So it could look like that, and it often does in Western France. In the near continent and in this country, it tends to be a species of grazing marsh ditches where you have lovely diverse emergent vegetation along the edges and quite often water soldier floating on the ditch surfaces. It can be more a species of what we think of in this country as conventional fens with great fen sedge. And when you get really into southern Europe, you do get it in reed beds. We don't get it in reed beds in much of Western Europe. I think when you get into southern Europe, there's enough sunshine for the sun to penetrate lower down into reed beds for them to provide suitable conditions. Well, it always seems slightly bizarre that such a big and conspicuous species wasn't discovered in Britain until 1956, when eminent arachnologist, former BAS president and also eminent conservationist, Eric Duffy found it at Redgrave and Lopham Fen in East Anglia. So I want to look at, since Eric's discovery, which is getting on for 70 years ago now, it's only been found at 2 more sites in Britain. On the Pevensey Levels in 1988, so the grazing marshes between Eastbourne and Bexhill, and Crumlin Bog and the Tennant Canal next to it on the outskirts of Swansea. I mean, Crumlin Bog, I think we would all recognise as a fen, not a bog, probably has a lot of fen elements. So because of its rarity, inevitably the spider has all the accolades we give things that are on the verge of becoming extinct. So it's obviously classified as nationally rare. It was one of the Biological Action Plan species, which have now become the NERC Act S41 species. It's one of only 2 spiders in Britain currently fully protected by law under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Perhaps most importantly, on our red list in this country of species we consider at risk of extinction, it's classified as vulnerable to extinction. And even more importantly, and we've just reassessed this, it's on the international red list as vulnerable to extinction. So our obligations in Britain are not just local, they're international. But I think the other interesting thing about this map is this really weird disjunct distribution. It's a very long way between these three populations. And logically, it really has to be telling us this spider was once very much more common, certainly across the southern half of Britain. So I want to look at why it isn't now, why it's so rare, and why we didn't record it before 1956. Well, the big thing here has to be wetland habitat loss. There are lots of figures around for wetland habitat loss in Britain. A recent reassessment internationally has put it at 78% in Britain for inland wetlands between 1700 and 2020. And you'll see some figures much higher than that. But I think the important point is that of wetlands we have left, most are very badly degraded relative to their former states. So they're smaller, they're more isolated from one another, they have less water because of groundwater abstraction or drainage of the surrounding areas, and the water quality in those sites is less good than it used to be because of eutrophication, usually from farm fertilizer pollution. So we have been losing wetlands at a great rate, and the wetland rarities that live there have been going at a similar rate, almost certainly including fen ruff spiders. I think our three remaining sites in Britain are really microcosms of that sort of longer term national picture. So although the Pevensey Levels is an area of about 3,500 square kilometres, a big, sorry, yes, that's right, a big area of grazing marshes, much of it up in the post-war period, including small areas of good quality grazing marsh and rich ditches, and most of them affected by falling water levels from deep drainage and by agrochemical pollution. In South Wales, the Tennant Canal and Crumlin Bog are hemmed in by major industrial and urban developments, and Crumlin Bog itself is rather dominated not just by the hills around it, by the huge hill of the main municipal rubbish tip for Swansea. So these are very challenged sites. And perhaps most famously in terms of challenge, Redgrave and Lopham Fen in East Anglia, where Eric first found the spider, should look like this. So huge beds of great fen sedge, pocked by little turf ponds made by old peat diggings, full of bladderwort in flower there. But very often in the last half of the 20th century, those ponds look more like this. So this site, about the same time that Eric found the spiders, a borehole was being sunk next to the fen for public water supply. And over the next several decades, the fen was really pumped dry. And as we started to hit climate change summers and droughts, that became very acute. The first one in 1976, Eric Duffy actually thought the spiders had become extinct then. And certainly by the time we got into the 1990s, this sort of drought was a very common feature, and the spiders were hugely challenged. Nobody ever did any systematic survey there in the early years, but sort of piecing together from people's notebooks where the minimum area we know spiders were in the 1970s. I've got these patches, the green outline is the boundary of the reserve. And we saw that shrink in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, again, shrinking to two small isolated patches. And in the worst years, we were down to probably under 2 hectares in total, 2 patches isolated by about 400 metres of fen and increasingly woodland at that point because the fen was so dry. So really dire straits, and the spider coming very, very close to extinction at this site. So wetland habitat loss, probably the big one, but there are other sort of Achilles heels for discovering the spider. And another big one has been misidentification. So as I expect most people know, we have 2 Raft spiders in Western Europe and in Britain. The other Raft spider, Dolomedes fimbriatus, is nationally scarce in Britain. It's a species of acidic habitat, so in the lowlands, wet heathland areas such as the Dorset and Hampshire heaths and the Ashdown forest, and in the uplands, blanket bog areas. So habitat immediately sort of is a bit of a red flag which spider you might be looking at. It's not definitive, you should always check. And unfortunately, the 2 species look incredibly similar. They're very easy to muddle up. I think with a lot of experience, you can get it right most of the time, but really they have to be checked. And the checking depends, as for so many pairs of similar spiders, on the genitalia. I've just given the male here. So this is the end of the palp, and the critical feature is the tibial apophysis, which is obviously not something you're going to see with the naked eye. So in Dolomedes fimbriatus, it's a sort of glove shape with a sort of thumb sticking out the side. Sorry, in Dolomedes plantarius. In Dolomedes fimbriatus, we don't get that thumb, it's more of a just straight pointed hypophysis. And another feature that's useful and another bit of a red flag is that in Dolomedes plantarius, the fen wrasse spider, not in Dolomedes fimbriatus, you usually get a proportion of the population that lacks the go faster stripes down the sides, so is unbanded. And it's probably fortuitous that the first one that Eric Duffy saw at Redgrave and Lopham Fen was unbanded, so that immediately flagged up for him that he might not be looking at Dolomedes fimbriatus. And it's a pity the same didn't happen at Crumlin Bog and on the Pevensey levels, because spiders, the raft spiders, were known to be at those sites well before they were correctly identified. So those discoveries could have come a lot earlier with a bit more careful arachnology. So there's a lessons in all this for us for the future. But to add to the problems of misidentification, this spider has suffered from terrible taxonomic confusion, and really quite unnecessarily so, because these two species were separated by Carl Alexander Clerk in 1757. But this separation wasn't accepted by European arachnologists until the 1930s at the earliest. So we have centuries when people were identifying all raft spiders, certainly in Britain and probably a lot of Western Europe, as Dolomedes fimbriatus, which is quite a big problem. This slide is really to illustrate that point about misidentification, but also my first point about wetland loss. This is Wicken Fen, one of the tiny remnants of the formerly enormous area of the East Anglian Fen Basin. So we have a few handfuls now, well, a small handful of degraded fen remnants, of which Wicken is probably one of the most famous. Less than 1% of the former area of the fen remains now. So you could see that if these spiders were there, the chances of finding them have become progressively pretty low. And drainage of the fen started in Roman times. It accelerated in the 1600s when the Dutch engineers arrived here. And by the mid-19th century, we were losing 1,000 hectares a year of the fens to drainage. So huge rate. And from that period, the mid-19th century, Ian Dawson, former BAS Consec, an RSPB librarian, has done some fantastic research in the Cambridge libraries and found significant number of quotations like this, recording Dolomedes fimbriatus, which it would have to be at that point because it was the only species recognised, and excellent descriptions. Fine species measuring in the body an inch in length is not uncommon in the fens, occasionally in ponds such as at Kitchen Garden at Wilburn Temple. This has to be Dolomedes plantarius. This is perfect Dolomedes plantarius habitat, and on the continent it's often a species of monastic fish ponds. So I think this, and references indeed by Blackwall, John Blackwall, who we know to be, one of our great arachnologists. Leonard Jennings, who wrote this, was one of Charles Darwin's set in Cambridge. These people knew what they were doing, and they were, producing many records of this spider. Rather than find this interesting, I have to say, although we all worship Bill Bristow as a demigod in arachnology, he and other arachnologists in the first half of the last century, rather than going out there and looking for these spiders in the rapidly diminishing remnants of the Cambridgeshire fens, were pouring cold water on their veracity, not just that they were not Dolomedes fimbriatus, but saying perhaps they were making a mistake and this was Pirata piscatorius as we now know it. And the chances really of people like Blackwall mistaking Dolomedes fimbriatus for Pirata piscatorius are very low, and Bristow himself knew that Blackwall had Dolomedes specimens in his collection, so Blackwall was not going to have done that. So why there was this terrible reluctance to accept these records, I really don't know, but it set back any chances of finding remnant populations at that time. So it looks slightly out of focus to me, so I hope it doesn't to you. But thanks to the wonderful Francis Farcox, as we all know, he's wonderful. I've also more recently found references to the spiders in fen ditches of Norfolk. So good descriptions here from the wonderfully named Reverend Revett Shepherd, again, one of the Charles Darwin's set naturalists of the mid-19th century. And he describes rightly the spiders sitting on floating mats of vegetation. He suggests probably held together by slight silken cords, and you do indeed see silk very often where the spiders have been sitting for a long period. So a good description from another area of the country, an area that I'm particularly interested in. But again, we find problems with accepting these records, and rather than thinking this record is interesting, getting arachnologists out looking for spiders in the fen ditches of Norfolk, Bristow, in the world of spiders, is clearly aware of this, but he uses it to pour cold water on the name fen raft spider. He says the name that's been known for a century owing to one error in the literature which has been blindly copied ever since, and this is clearly the article he's referring to by the Reverend Shepherd. And he goes on to make out that Shepherd was saying that the spiders were building Kon-Tiki style rafts, which clearly they're not. But again, another sort of setback for trying to find the spider. Well, it doesn't end with misidentification, habitat loss, taxonomic confusion, a couple more problems with finding the spider. Clearly, it's a spider of very inaccessible habitats. These are not the sort of places you go to on your average Sunday afternoon spider bashing. So again, another reason, I think, why people did not record them when they were still around to be recorded. And finally, although it seems like rather a strange thing for such a big and conspicuous and well-marked spider, they're incredibly cryptically camouflaged. And if you've been out to look for them, you'll know what I mean. So just a few tests on this. Each of these pictures has one in, looking for dark spiders with white lines on this sort of very busy background with lots of light lines where sun hits the meniscus and you've got lots of grass stems. Isn't easy. This is the easy one of these. Here's quite a gravid big female spider right in the centre of the picture if you haven't spotted her. This one, the spider's a bit more difficult. It's down here, look, but these are not, I hope, jumping out at you. And they're not even jumping out at me, I have to say. I did these a long time ago. I think this is the trickiest of them. The spider is actually over here. You can see the front part of its body and the rather yellowy line on the cephalothorax here, and its legs spread out here. So these are really difficult animals to see. So lots of reasons, I think, why its past has been a bit mysterious, but I do think now we're in a position where, short of finding a Victorian spirit collection which is well labelled, and sadly Blackpool's specimens were not well labelled, I think we have good evidence now that the spider was in the fens and in the Norfolk fen ditches and the grazing marshes, and hopefully we'll come across more evidence that helps us join up those dots of the remnant sites. So with 3 sites left in Britain, we have to sort of think about the future for this spider. It's an intrinsically precarious position for any species, and all of those sites are badly challenged by climate change. So a main plank of the species recovery programme for the spider in Britain for a long time now has been to increase the number of populations. And we had a goal of aiming to have 12 populations rather than 3 by 2020. We're not there, we weren't there in 2020, but we do now have 7 populations, so 4 new ones, which were established in the Norfolk Broads by translocation since 2010. It's quite clear from our research that translocation was going to be the only way we were going to get new populations of this species. It's not mobile enough to do it on its own and to find restored habitat patches scattered across Britain. Translocation is a complicated procedure. There are rightly a lot of guidelines in place as to how you do it to ensure that you don't deplete the source populations, that you don't put the spiders in sites where they're not going to thrive, that you don't damage the sites that you're translocating to. So it's a long and complicated business and a talk in its own right, but just to give you an idea of the scale of the of the work. In Broadland, to establish our 4 new populations, we released about 6,000 3-month-old spiderlings that were individually hand-reared from the red grave and Lopham Fen population, and also about 56 spiders in their nurseries, so 56 broods, probably amounting to another 25,000, I'm sorry, tiny spiderlings from the Pevensey levels where we could actually harvest nurseries because the population is a lot bigger. So we were really spider bombing these sites in the Broads. And all of the sites were on the River Waveney initially, so downstream from Redgrave and Lopham Fen, but they look like the Pevensey levels, so grazing marsh ditches, often with water soldier on them. So we use both populations to populate these areas. So Redgrave and Lopham Fen is down here at the source of the Waveney. We started in 2010 at Castle Marshes on the lower Waveney and moved down further to Carlton Marshes, both Suffolk Wildlife Trust reserves, in the following 2 years. So each of these sites had a bombing of spiders in 2 consecutive years. And then we moved up through the Broads catchment onto the River Yare to the Mid-Yare complex, which birders amongst you will know includes the Strumpshaw RSPB Nature Reserve. And then finally in 2014 and 15 up to the National Nature Reserve at Ludham and Potter Heigham on the River Thurne. And to give you a quick indication of how the spiders are doing there, these are the lower Waveney, 2 sites quite close together. The pink lines are where the ditches where we put the spiders when we first introduced them. There's a scale line down at the bottom here to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about. So we've now got about 145 hectares of occupied ditches around Castle Marshes, well beyond the reserve boundary now. I haven't looked out to the west to see if they're out there, but that's one for this summer. And a smaller but significant spread at Carlton Marshes, and there's no doubt that these populations are going to meet up, if they haven't already and we haven't detected it, at some point and form a very large area down there. Up at Ludham and Potter Heigham, our most recent population, again the pink lines, the introduction ditches, the spiders have again practically filled the National Nature Reserve. They're on virtually all of the ditches there. And the big one is really the Mid-Yare Reserve. So this is a 2-kilometre bar at the bottom here, 320 hectares at least now of grazing marsh occupied by the spiders and still moving on an annual basis. The Strumpshaw Reserve is up at this end here. And I think that the area of spiders we have in the Broads now is actually very equivalent to the area on the Pevensey levels. So we've got a 5-kilometre line here. The Pevensey Levels Basin occupies the whole of this area. The restored and the best grazing marsh areas are marked in the sort of orange blocks where you have spiders on a high proportion of the ditches. And then in the more heavily arabilised areas, we have little outliers. So we've always thought of this as a massive population, but I think the Broads are now challenging that in scale. What it looks like in practice is this. This is a ditch at Castle Marshes taken at about 5 o'clock in the morning on an August morning. And I just found this a wonderful picture because all these bright patches of fen raft spider nurseries on the water soldier filled up with dew at that time of day. And here we have the Reverend Shepherd's fen ditches of Norfolk with their raft spiders back. And they're clearly back in what's an incredibly rich community for spiders, as you can see by the huge diversity and quantity of other spider silk that's around. And these are also very rich ditches for a wide range of other aquatic invertebrates, as they are at the remnant sites for this species. So it's something that seems to be able to slot back into this rich ecosystem that it was lost from. And that's what those lovely nurseries look like close up. And I think this also points out that these were actually quite high density populations, as well as now large populations. We're getting a lot of nurseries packed in there. Things have improved at Redgrave and Lopham Fen as well. So this is where we got to in the worst years of the 1990s. The artesian abstraction was stopped on the fen with a huge restoration operation in the late 1990s. It took a long time for the fen to recover from that, and that was reflected in a long gap before the spider population started picking up and colonising what you can see here are new scrapes that were created in the 1990s. But it's done that fairly well now. The spiders are back on about a third of the reserve. There's quite a lot more area that they could occupy and hopefully will do. But we're in a very much better situation, much stronger situation there. So for anybody who did want the Twitcher's Guide to where we are now, here it is. So we currently have 7 sites in Britain. The spiders are quite easy to see, and there's good public access and facilities at Carlton Marshes down near Lowestoft on the Lower Waveney, at Redgrave and Lopham Fen still, and in South Wales, I wouldn't say they're good visit facilities, but the spiders are often quite easy to see from the towpath on the Tennant Canal. Less easy to see at Crumlin Bog. On the Mid-Year Reserve, we're hoping that they will continue to move westward, and they'll soon be relatively easy to see from the public paths around the Strumpshaw part of the reserve. And that's another place with good public facilities. If you're lucky, you might see one from there now. They're less easy to see on the Pevensey levels and the Ludden Potham Higher Reserve, where you can really only access on footpaths. And Castle Marshes on the Lower Waveney is an access by permit only reserve for public safety. So rewardingly, I think they've become very much easier for people to see. And that is one of the justifications for the translocation work and the effort we've put in to trying to ensure that they remain as part of our arachnofauna in Britain. But what's it going to be like in the future? So we have to do a last chance to see, if you want to twitch them, do you need to get on with it? Well, sadly, I think the answer to that is yes. This map is from the same paper as the one I showed you earlier, and it's based on modelling of climate change scenarios by 2040. And in this scenario, it's showing you areas where the spiders are likely to be lost and where they're likely to be gained. And we can see that in quite a lot of areas of Western Europe, including quite a swathe of Britain, habitat is going to become unsuitable for them. And instead, habitat is going to become more suitable as we move further up into Scandinavia and eastwards into Russia and Ukraine and so on. So potentially a big shift in range, but there are of course problems with that. These spiders are not going to be able to shift their range at all easily. We know they're not very mobile. They have a job to get around unless you give them a lift. And we also know that this is a very broad brush approach through modelling. And although thankfully it still shows East Anglia as being suitable for the spiders in 2040, it can't take account of local factors. So we have local problems in East Anglia, and one is that the Broads are becoming progressively and sometimes stepwise more saline because we're getting more storm surges, and so the riverbanks are breaking more frequently and flooding large areas of grazing marshes. We're also getting progressive creep of saline water under the riverbanks. So the Broads, we suspect, will be lost as freshwater habitat by the middle of this century, which is quite a scary thought. And indeed, Redgrave and Lopham Fen suffers from different problems, but that is also, I think, likely to be lost as fen raft spider habitat by the middle of the century. The droughts that we had last year and 3 years ago, and maybe going to have this year, make the fen look like this. Last year we had no water at all on the reserve or even in the River Waveney through the reserve for 3 months of the year. The effect it has on the spiders is this. This is the breeding season, just looking at numbers of nurseries during 2021. In 2022, the season started well, but by the time we got to about the second week of July, everything started to collapse, and it was all over by the third week of July. So very rapidly curtailed breeding season, very much lower numbers of nurseries in total. How many seasons like that the spiders can tolerate consecutively, we don't know, and maybe about to find out, but probably not more than 2 or 3, I should say. So a pretty grim prospect there. So not to finish on a total downer, obviously we're looking at how to mitigate climate change for this species in Britain. So this is not a very good map, but it shows the Wash, and the busy areas are the old East Anglian Fen Basin. Within those, the pink patches, areas of major habitat restoration going on there. So, as I said earlier, less than 1% of the former fenland remains. With the planned restoration projects, we're currently looking at just over 5% of the former area gradually being restored to fenland. And so these are obvious targets where we're going to be moving the spiders next. But this isn't going to be enough because with sea level rise, a lot of this area is below sea level, and we don't expect it to have a very long-term future as freshwater habitat. So we've got to be looking for more, bigger, better, joined up Lawton-style nature reserves, further inland, further north, right up to Scotland. Everything will be on the cards. And bigger, better and joined up is very much, the main plank of conservation efforts. It's something that's very much happened with those sites we've been using in the Broads, but we needed it to happen on a much bigger scale and in more places. And the will is certainly there in the conservation movement, but sadly, the money to back it up often isn't. So these spiders, and of course many other species like that, and particularly wetland species, are going to be dependent on that if they're going to have a future in our fauna, sadly. So that's my race through the past, present, and hopefully future. So thank you to everybody for watching. Thanks to the many organisations and people, far too many to list now, who've contributed to getting spiders to the position they're now in over the last 3 decades. And thanks particularly in the context of this talk to Ian Dawson for his meticulous historical research about Cambridgeshire Fens, which you can read in one of our newsletters. I think I put the reference earlier in the talk, so we'll be able to grab that when we get these onto YouTube, if I can bear to see it there. Okay, thanks very much. I haven't been watching the time, I'm so sorry, so I hope it's not too awful.
No, that's been fine. Thank you very much indeed, Helen. That was fascinating stuff, and I'm sure of interest to many of us. Are there any questions for Helen?
I've got one. Helen, you mentioned water soldier. How important is it that you've got a sort of large sort of semi-emergent plant in the ditches? How important is that for the spiders?
Very. So it's like it creates a sort of fast breeder reactor system for them. So it increases the amount of suitable habitat for breeding enormously. So you can pack in the nursery webs. We can get up to 8 times more spiders per unit length of ditch where we have water soldier than where we don't. So in terms of starting a translocation, it gets it off to a really good start, but they will also build their nurseries in many other species. I've recorded them in over 50 plant species on the ditch edges. So I think when it's not present, you tend to get a lower density population and a slower growth rate, but they should be okay. But I think in those new populations, the water soldiers are a funny beast, and sometimes it does very well and then the population will completely crash. So I think the spiders population dynamics are going to be quite dependent on whether it's a good or a bad year for water soldier, and they're going to be quite up and down, but they should be fine in bad years once the population's well established. But it's an interesting relationship. We've seen very much the same thing with Norfolk hawk or dragonflies, which everybody used to think were completely dependent on it, but they're not. But they do really, incredibly well where it's present.
Thank you. Anybody else with a question for Helen?
Katie has one.
Hello,
Katie?
can you hear me?
Hi, Katie.
Hiya. In the future then, is thinking about the water soldier potential relationship, would it make sites more suitable if water soldier was introduced?
Yes, but I think that's quite a complicated one. I think for sites where there's no recorded history of water soldier present, that will be quite controversial. I have to say we did actually try that at Redgrave and Nopham Fen when things were really dire here in the 1990s. And the water soldier didn't establish here. And we did undertake to take it all out again, which would have been quite tricky if it had done well, I think. And we did actually surface sterilise all the water soldier before we put them here. So I had a lawn covered in children's paddling pools at that time, full of bleach and mild bleach. And we actually, you know, it was a huge operation. But I think sites where we do know there's been water soldier in the past, like the Hampshire chalk stream fens, which had both great fen sedge and water soldier, I think, in the past, it might be worth thinking about. So I think, you know, I think introduction always has to be thought about really carefully. But I mean, in principle, yes. In practice, there will be a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Shout out if you're... Okay, well, thank you very much, Helen. As I say, fascinating talk, and if you're interested in the historical research that in the newsletter, then the reference is there somewhere in the presentation.